King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
A king who spent 7 decades waiting for his crown does not surrender it quietly. And yet, on an ordinary morning inside one of the most ceremonially protected buildings in the world, a folder moved from one pair of hands to another, and the British monarchy changed in ways that no public announcement could fully capture. The words "the time has come" were not spoken into a microphone or broadcast across national television. They were spoken in a room where the air was still, the witnesses were few, and the weight of a single sentence pressed down like something physical. When the palace later confirmed that abdication papers had been signed, those 4 words became the most consequential phrase in modern royal history. Not because they ended a reign, but because they proved that even the most guarded institution in the world could not protect one man from the private reckoning that had been building for years. To understand why this moment arrived when it did, and why it landed the way it did, you have to go back further than the signing itself. You have to go back to the kind of accumulated pressure that institutions absorb slowly, invisibly, and then release all at once in a single irrevocable act. The British monarchy has survived wars, abdications, divorces, and public humiliations before. It absorbed the seismic shock of Edward VIII's departure in 1936. It endured the painful unraveling of Charles's first marriage and the aftermath that followed. It weathered the tension of a modern royal family struggling to define itself in an age of constant scrutiny. Each time, the institution bent without breaking, restructured without acknowledging just how close to fracture it had come. But what happened behind the palace's closed doors in the lead-up to this confirmation was not simply another episode of institutional survival. It was something more personal, more corrosive, and more quietly devastating than anything protocol could contain. Royal biographer Robert Lacey, whose decades of work on the House of Windsor have established him as one of the most credible observers of the monarchy's internal dynamics, has written extensively about the psychological burden carried by heirs who spend extraordinary lengths of time waiting for a role they were born to fulfill. In his book Monarchy, The Life and Reign of Elizabeth II, Lacey explored how the structure of hereditary monarchy creates an almost unbearable paradox. The heir must remain perpetually ready without ever showing impatience, must project confidence without appearing to reach for power, and must publicly honor the reign above their own ambitions while privately preparing for a transition that can only arrive through loss. Charles III lived that paradox longer than any heir in British history. He became the longest-serving Prince of Wales before ascending to the throne at an age when most of his predecessors had already spent decades as monarch. That waiting shaped him. It hollowed out certain expectations and deepened others. And when he finally wore the crown, the weight of it arrived alongside a physical reality that no amount of ceremonial preparation had truly accounted for. The palace had been managing the public perception of the king's health with the kind of careful, measured language that royal communications offices had perfected over generations. Statements were calibrated to reassure without revealing. Appointments were adjusted without explaining the adjustments too clearly. Aides spoke in general terms about the demands of royal duty, while privately understanding that the demands had become something the king's body could no longer absorb indefinitely. Investigative royal correspondent Roya Nika, who has reported extensively on the internal workings of the palace for the Sunday Times, and whose sourcing within royal circles is considered among the deepest in British journalism, has noted that the palace operates on a principle of managed disclosure, releasing information in controlled doses at controlled times through controlled channels. But managed disclosure has its limits. There comes a point when the gap between what is being disclosed and what is actually happening becomes impossible to sustain without consequence. That point arrived not with dramatic announcement, but with something far more intimate and destabilizing. A rehearsal inside Windsor Castle that exposed a hesitation no aid could spin and no protocol could smooth over. The details of that rehearsal have emerged through careful reconstruction rather than official confirmation. What is understood from those close to the household is that a formal investiture rehearsal, a practice ceremony used to ensure that every element of a royal occasion proceeds with the precision the institution demands, became the moment when the king's uncertainty became visible to those around him. Charles paused before the royal oath, not for dramatic effect, not as a deliberate choice. He paused the way a person pauses when something internal fails to align with what the external moment is demanding. It was brief, but in a rehearsal room populated by people trained to read exactly these kinds of signals, brief was enough. William, who was present, moved instinctively, not toward ambition, but toward steadying a moment that had suddenly become fragile. That gesture, the son moving to stabilize the father, changed the emotional architecture of the room in a way that no one present would forget. The royal oath is not a casual formality. It is a formal declaration of duty, loyalty, and sovereign responsibility, the verbal anchor of a monarch's public identity. When the words of that oath felt uncertain in the king's mouth, the people in that room began, quietly and without saying so directly, to recalibrate. Camilla felt it, and felt it. The senior courtiers felt it. And Charles, who is nothing if not perceptive about the atmosphere in a room, felt it most acutely of all. He asked for the oath line to be read twice. The silence after that request settled into the room like sediment, heavy and slow and impossible to clear away. According to those familiar with the household's internal review process, a documented account of that rehearsal was later prepared for senior palace officials, not as an act of betrayal, but as an institutional necessity. The monarchy does not allow private uncertainty to remain unaddressed when it begins to affect the structural confidence of those closest to the crown. Princess Anne's role in what followed has been described by those familiar with her character as typically unsentimental and exactly necessary. The princess has never confused emotional loyalty with institutional clarity. In documented exchanges reviewed by senior household members and communicated to the king with a directness that has always defined her relationship with royal duty. Hesitation at the oath was no longer a private matter once the institution itself had witnessed it. The monarchy could survive grief, she made clear. It could survive illness. It could survive the complicated human emotions that come with a long reign and a complex family. What it could not survive, what it had never survived, was the appearance of confusion at its center, and was not being cruel. She was being the kind of honest that only someone who has spent a lifetime watching the monarchy absorb crises can truly afford to be. Charles received a revised transition file from a senior aide in the days that followed. The language of a transition file sounds bureaucratic, but its meaning inside a royal household is anything but. It is a practical architecture for movement of power, a step-by-step framework for transferring duties, authority, public responsibilities, and institutional credibility from one stage of a reign to the next. When Charles looked at that file and understood, before the first page was fully turned, what its existence meant, he was not looking at a plan someone else had made for him. He was looking at the institutional acknowledgement that the moment of transition had moved from theoretical to operational. He did not express surprise. He did not object. He held the file with the quiet composure of a man who has already made a decision internally and is now watching the world catch up to what his own understanding had already accepted. The conversation between Charles and Camilla that preceded the formal signing has been described by those who were nearby, though not inside the room, as the most emotionally raw exchange of the entire transition period. Camilla entered believing that direct confrontation could still change the trajectory of events. She had survived too much, fought too long, and endured too many years of public judgment to accept that the role she had secured beside the king could simply be restructured away from her, without a final accounting. The queen consort asked Charles directly whether the papers had been signed out of duty, pressure, or surrender. It was the kind of question that only someone in a relationship of genuine intimacy could ask, because it named the three possibilities that the palace would never publicly acknowledge as distinct possibilities. Duty meant honor. Pressure meant vulnerability. Surrender meant defeat. Each carried a different meaning for the monarchy, for the family, and for the marriage. Charles did not answer quickly. That pause was not weakness. It was the silence of a man who had already understood that the three possibilities Camilla named were not actually separate. They had collapsed into each other. What felt like duty was also shaped by pressure. What looked like surrender was also an act of control. He repeated the words that had become, by that point, the closest thing to a complete explanation he was capable of giving. The time has come. Camilla heard finality in his voice, not resignation, not defeat. Finality, the specific tone of someone who has moved through the argument entirely and arrived at a place where further debate is not possible because a decision has already become something larger than the person who made it. She placed her hand on the folder. He moved it gently away. That small physical gesture ended the conversation in a way that no words could have. The queen consort understood in that moment, that she was not being excluded from a decision. She was being asked to accept one that had already, in every meaningful sense, been made. William waited outside that room. He had positioned himself there not to listen, but to be present, to demonstrate, through physical proximity, that he was not rushing toward anything. The prince understood that appearing eager would be its own kind of wound, both to his father and to the family's public image in the days that would follow. He also understood that staying outside when his father was facing the hardest conversation of his reign carried its own cost. In that hallway, William carried both things at once. The awareness that his life had permanently changed and the discipline to hold that awareness without letting it become expression. Royal correspondent Valentine Lowe, whose 2022 book Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, illuminated the behind-the-scenes machinery of the palace in ways that resonated deeply with observers of royal affairs, has written about the extraordinary emotional discipline required of those positioned near royal power, the way proximity to the throne demands a constant management of personal feeling and service of institutional appearance. William had been trained for exactly this discipline, but training and reality are not the same. And the hallway outside his father's private conversation was one of the places where that gap was most painfully felt. When the signed papers were confirmed and the formal transition process began in earnest, the first changes inside the palace were not dramatic. They were architectural. The arrangement authorities shifted in small, practical ways that only those familiar with palace operations would immediately recognize. Internal movement instructions, directions that govern who may enter certain spaces, which offices control which flows of information, how daily access to the king's household is structured, were revised. Several offices that had operated under Charles's direct authority began redirecting their communications toward William's transition team. A transition schedule was prepared for the prince, and when it was placed before him, William paused before signing it, not from reluctance, from the awareness that accepting a schedule is not the same as accepting what the schedule represents. He accepted both, because he had to, because the alternative was confusion, and confusion was the one thing the palace most urgently needed to prevent. Catherine's role in the immediate aftermath of the signing has been understated in most public accounts of the transition period, but those familiar with the household's emotional dynamics understand that her contribution was not decorative. The Princess of Wales has developed, through years of navigating the most scrutinized family institution in the world, a capacity for steady, grounding presence that functions differently from political skill or ceremonial polish. She does not command rooms. She stabilizes them. In the days after papers were signed, William needed someone who could absorb his private grief without amplifying it, who could remind him that duty can arrive before the heart is prepared without making that reminder feel cold. Catherine gave him that. She understood that the future king needed humanity beside him as much as he needed authority. The two things, she had learned over years of marriage inside the royal family, are not as naturally compatible as the public might assume. Power without feeling becomes brittle. Feeling without discipline becomes chaotic. The balance between them is where sustainable leadership lives, and Catherine helped William find that balance in the days when he was most in danger of losing it. Camilla's position in the restructured palace landscape emerged with painful clarity in the days following the confirmation. Several ceremonial decisions, choices about royal appearances, public roles, the allocation of duties and honors, were formally redirected to require William's approval. For Camilla, those redirections landed not as administrative changes, but as something closer to a verdict. She had spent years working to earn a place beside the king that felt secure, felt dignified, felt protected from the cold winds of public opinion that had blown against her for so long. Now the institutional architecture that had housed that security was being quietly disassembled piece by piece through the polite language of transition planning. Her influence had not been revoked. It had been made conditional in ways it never was before, and conditional influence is a specific kind of diminishment that those who have never held genuine power struggle to fully appreciate, and move through all of this with composure that was not coldness but hard-won clarity. The Princess Royal has always understood the monarchy as something larger than any individual's comfort, including her own. She has watched it absorb shocks that would have destroyed less durable institutions. She has watched members of her own family be reshaped, reduced, and sometimes discarded by the demands of institutional survival. She has made her own sacrifices in service of what she understands a crown to represent. When she watched the transition process unfold in the aftermath of the signing, her primary concern was preventing the kind of mixed signals that could travel beyond the palace and fracture public confidence. She communicated to William clearly. Mercy and weakness were not the same thing, and love for his father could not be allowed to become confusion for the crown. It was not a cold instruction. It was the wisdom of someone who had watched what happened when the line between personal grief and institutional clarity was not held firmly enough. The private conversation between Charles and William, the one without aides, without courtiers, without the carefully managed language of palace communication, became the emotional center of the entire transition. Two men sitting across from each other in a silence too personal for institutional language. The abdication papers had already spoken for the monarchy. What remained was a conversation between a father and a son, and that conversation required a different kind of honesty than anything the palace had prepared either of them for. Charles admitted that signing the abdication papers had felt like losing a part himself. The admission was not weakness. It was the truth of a man who had organized his entire identity around a role that was now being passed to someone else, and who understood, with full clarity, that the passing was necessary precisely because the role still mattered. He had not signed to escape. He had signed to protect. William listened without interrupting. He told his father that he had never wanted the throne to arrive through pain. It was the most honest thing either of them could have said, and Charles absorbed it with the relief of a man who has been waiting to be understood rather than excused. The king removed his signet ring, the personal royal ring that carries the weight of identity, family, and the lineage of authority, and held it briefly in his palm. He did not hand it over. Instead, he placed his hand over William's, and the gesture communicated something that formal documents cannot contain. This was not a transfer of property. It was an act of trust between a father who was letting go and a son who had promised not to erase what was being given to him. William's promise, that he would not erase his father's reign, gave Charles something more valuable than ceremony could provide. It gave him the dignity of being remembered as a man who stepped away from power, not because power had abandoned him, but because the institution he had served demanded that someone still capable of serving it fully must now take its weight. That distinction matters in the history of monarchies. Edward VIII left in scandal and self-interest. Charles III, whatever the complexities of the path that led here, left in an act that his own family was present to witness and, ultimately, to honor. When the confirmation reached the public, Britain did not erupt. It went quiet first. The gathered crowds outside Buckingham Palace stood in the specific silence that large groups of people produce when something has happened that is too large and too strange to process through immediate noise. Front pages appeared with language that felt too heavy for ordinary ink. Broadcast desks conveyed the news with the careful steadiness that journalists trained in the coverage of significant royal events know is required. The awareness that tone in these moments is not decoration but responsibility. People left flowers at the palace gates in the instinctive way that grief seeks a physical expression when the event itself is too large to sit with internally. Others simply read the headlines again and again, as though repetition might make the words more believable. The public response revealed something important about the relationship between the British people and their monarchy that is easy to underestimate in ordinary times. The institution has been criticized, satirized, questioned, and at times openly resented by significant portions of the population. But the moment of genuine transition, the moment when a human being at the center of the institution makes a decision that is visibly costly and visibly honest, produces a response that transcends the ordinary political feelings people carry about the crown. It produces recognition. The recognition that duty and sacrifice are not abstract values, but things that real people pay real prices for. Charles's departure from the throne, whatever anyone thinks of his reign, his marriages, or his politics, carried that kind of cost. And the British public, whatever its relationship with the monarchy in ordinary times, understood it. William appeared in the palace's formal public response with a controlled composure that the moment demanded. He did not look like a man who had won something. He looked like a man who had been asked to carry something very heavy, who had agreed because the alternative was worse, and who was now walking steadily forward because stopping was not possible. Catherine stood close enough to anchor the impression without drawing attention away from him. Every royal observer who has covered a family for serious outlets, from Omid Scobie, whose work has illuminated the fractures within the modern royal family, to Anna Pasternak, whose research into royal relationships has produced some of the most nuanced accounts of life inside the palace, would understand precision required of every gesture, every expression, every positioning decision in that moment. The palace had been practicing this kind of image management for generations. But what made this moment different from ordinary palace management was that the grief underneath the composure was entirely real. There was no gap between performance and the feeling. The feeling was a performance because the reality was too large to be anything other than itself. Camilla watched the coverage from inside the palace with the particular loneliness of someone who is surrounded by the institution that has shaped her life and simultaneously excluded from its current narrative. She watched William's name rise. She watched Catherine's steadiness praised. She saw Charles described by journalists, by historians, by people on the streets outside, as brave, tired, historic, and deeply human. The descriptions were not wrong, but they left no room for her, and that absence was its own quiet verdict on the shape of the transition. She had not been removed. She had been made peripheral in a story where she had always fought to be central, and the distinction between those two things is narrow enough to cause maximum pain. What the abdication of Charles III ultimately reveals about the British monarchy is not weakness. It is a specific kind of institutional durability that only becomes visible when the institution is genuinely tested. Monarchies that survive do so not because they are incapable of change, but because they have built into themselves, through centuries of crisis, adaptation, and occasional heartbreak, a capacity to prioritize continuity over the comfort of any individual within them. Charles understood that. It is why the words "a time has come" carried weight beyond their literal meaning. They were not an admission of defeat. They were a statement of institutional loyalty, the recognition that the crown, as an idea and as a responsibility, mattered more than the personal cost of releasing it. The signed abdication papers did not close a chapter on the monarchy. They renewed it, painfully, expensively, and with a specific honesty that only genuine sacrifice can produce. William will carry forward a reign shaped by his father's example in ways that neither of them could have fully predicted. Catherine will help him hold the balance between feeling and discipline that sustainable leadership requires, and will continue to guard the institutional core with the unsentimental clarity that has always defined her service. And Camilla will navigate a place that has been permanently recontoured by forces larger than any of them could individually have controlled. These are not comfortable outcomes for everyone involved. They were not meant to be. Charles stood before the signed papers for the last time, and the silence around him carried something different from what it had carried in the weeks before. Earlier, the silence had been full of fear. The fear of making the decision. The fear of its consequences. The fear of what came after the pen touched paper. Now the silence held something quieter and stranger. It held the specific piece of the man who has made the hardest choice available to him and understood, fully and without reservation, why it was the right one. He had waited a lifetime for the crown. He had worn it through illness, controversy, personal transformation, and the slow accumulation of a reign that was both longer desired and more complicated than he had imagined it would be. And at the end of all of that, he had proven something that neither his supporters nor his critics had expected him to prove, that the man who spent so long waiting for power was capable, when it truly mattered, of letting it go. That is not a small thing. In a world where power is hoarded, defended, and rationalized by those who hold it, where stepping back is almost always described as being pushed, Charles did something genuinely unusual. He chose. He declared the time had come before the institution was forced to declare it for him. He protected the crown by releasing it, and in doing so, he may have secured a place in royal history that his long years as an heir never quite guaranteed. Not as the king who waited longest, but as the king who, when the moment came, understood exactly what the moment required. History will carry that judgment forward. The palace gates will close and open again. The flowers left outside will fade. But the decision made in that still room, with the pen still close and the words already spoken, will outlast all of it. The papers are signed. The transition has begun. But what happens inside that palace next? Between William and Camilla, between duty and grief, between the crown and the family beneath it, that story is only just opening. Charles walked away from a folder without looking back. What he walked toward and what the monarchy walks toward with him remains the most consequential question in modern royal history.